Thanks for joining us for what I believe is going to be a fascinating discussion about how business and life in Asia may change in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Chris Grimes, and I'm the executive editor of Nikkei Asian Review. And with me are three of my brilliant NAR colleagues. Nikki Sun, a member of our crack business reporting team in Hong Kong. Kenji Kawase, our chief business news correspondent, who, as it turns out, has just moved from Tokyo to Hong Kong and is coming to us live from a hotel where he's doing quarantine for 2 weeks. And Shotaro Otani, who's been doing an amazing job over the last couple of years covering Indonesia's fascinating startup scene, as well as economics and politics and just about everything else that happens there. So it's been 140 days since the Wuhan government first confirmed that doctors there were treating patients who were sick with a new type of viral pneumonia. Today, less than 5 months later, what the world now knows as coronavirus has killed more than 300,000 people, and global cases are still rising sharply, nearing almost 5 million cases. And in addition to all of this death and misery, it's brought the global economy to a near standstill. And while we're starting to see glimmers of hope in Asia Pacific with New Zealand, Thailand, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Vietnam reporting days in a row with 0 infections, we still have some difficult and uncertain days ahead of us. Jerome Powell, the Federal Reserve Chief in the US, said earlier this week that the US recovery could stretch through to the end of next year, though he was quick to add, we really don't know. So as Powell's remark indicated, making forecasts while you're in the middle of a raging crisis is tricky work. This has made me think of my career about 20 years ago when I covered the aftermath of 9/11 in New York for the Financial Times. And I remember really well some of the predictions that people were making at that time. Wall Street was going to cease to exist as financial institutions moved to safer places in the suburbs. Families would flee New York City forever. And as a result, commercial property and residential property prices would collapse. The city would return to the blight and crime last seen in the 1970s. So these were reasonable predictions, but they all turned out to be pretty much incorrect. The city subsequently went on a building spree. The population grew strongly as many families chose to raise their children in the city, and that crime wave never really happened. That lesson about making predictions in the heat of a crisis has always stayed with me in the back of my head as I've continued my work as a journalist, including covering the global financial crisis from New York and the Eurozone crisis from London. But we have some of the world's leading business and economic thinkers, very, very serious people who have navigated many ups and downs in the business and economic cycle, are making some really convincing arguments right now about why the coronavirus is indeed a world-changing event. So let's start with Warren Buffett, a man well known for taking a very long-term view, a man who doesn't sell stocks and buy stocks based on short-term phenomena. So given his reputation, it was pretty dramatic and unexpected when he unloaded all of his stakes in American Airlines, stakes that totaled about $4 billion, all based on his expectation that the travel industry was due for a really profound shift. The world has changed for the airlines, Buffett said. In Japan, Toyota Motors Akio Toyota is thinking that a big shift is taking place in how we will work after the coronavirus is over. As Kenji reported just last week in Nikkei Asian Review, Toyota-san said that his time in lockdown has led him to rethink how the company runs. With fewer in-person meetings and fewer pointless pieces of documents being produced for those meetings, he could spend more time with his team working on important things. Teleconferencing, he said, allows people to discuss only what we need to discuss. And he even said he'd reconsider a concept that in English translates as real thing, real place. In practice, this would mean that Toyota executives wouldn't have to visit a place just to have an in-person meeting anymore. Then there's Larry Summers, the former US Treasury Secretary who navigated the early days of the post-Lehman crisis as a member of the Obama administration. Last week, he wrote in the Financial Times that the pandemic may be remembered as the hinge moment where we truly entered the Asian century. And in recent days, The Economist magazine declared that the coronavirus would be the last nail in the coffin of what it called the greatest era of globalization ever. These are all really big ideas about how huge industries may be transformed and how the way we work may change and about the future of the global economy. They probably aren't all correct, but it's clear that the coronavirus is accelerating changes that were already happening, whether it's the loss of faith in globalization, the decline of traditional retailers, or tensions between China and the US. So for investors and business people, the challenge is how to navigate this difficult period while also positioning themselves to gain from the inevitable change that the crisis brings about. As the old saying goes, in a crisis, be aware of the danger, but recognize the opportunity. So in that spirit, we'll turn now to our excellent panelists to talk about the risks and the possible opportunities for Asia after the coronavirus. So we'll start with Nikki, who among other things covers the property market in Hong Kong. So Nikki, we've all been stuck working from home, doing lots of meetings like this via Zoom, and this has prompted talk of the end of the office. Twitter, to name one company, has told its employees that they can work from home forever. So what are your contacts in the Hong Kong property market saying? Are they beginning to worry about demand when this is all over?
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Hello from Hong Kong. Yes, definitely, we're seeing weaker demand for office leasing in Hong Kong as well as the rest of Asia. Actually, this is more about economic reasons instead of the future working philosophy. We just published a story today on our Nikkei website that a survey showed that 70% of major Asia cities are seeing decreasing leasing activities in the past months, and 30% of the companies are saying we are cutting the size of office when we return to work. So this is a really alarming sign for property developers. What we are seeing here in Hong Kong is that the company are relocating to a remote area to save a cost. And also, some of the companies move their stuff to a co-working space. But right now, very, very few companies have made the decision to cut the physical office completely. So we will see what will happen in the future.
Yeah, they have some hard decisions to make over the next year or so, probably. So office sharing companies, the most famous, of course, is WeWork, have been really, they were having a rough time before the coronavirus, and now they're really struggling. But when people are becoming more accustomed to working a few days from home or doing a video conference, does this kind of office sharing model make more sense?
Absolutely. Actually, Chris, I'm right now in a co-working space, and if you look at my background, this is the common area of co-working space. From my experience, it has been very nice, and actually a lot of co-working space operators told me that they actually get new clients during this crisis because a lot of companies are giving up their permanent office to move to co-working space because the economic uncertainties, they don't know how long their business could last. So there are certainly a lot of opportunities. And if we take a longer view, actually a lot of analysts are expecting the future office to be a combination of home office, multiple co-working space locations, and a base office in a very prime location, but maybe smaller. So this way, those companies can retain the prestige of having this very prime office location, but at the same time, employees can enjoy working in the more flexible and relaxing, convenient environment. But as you said, this is a very difficult time for co-working space operators as well as property developers as a whole. So they have to survive to be able to thrive.
So that's really expensive. Hong Kong obviously is a city renowned for really high commercial property prices. So if companies may still end up having locations in really expensive areas, but it sounds like you're saying that companies may want to have smaller footprints in those expensive buildings. Is that the idea?
Yeah, I guess it's still very attractive to be able to have office in a very prime location. For example, Hong Kong is a financial center. Most financial institutions, especially those Chinese companies, are willing to pay great premium to rent a tiny office in Central, so they can have this central office location print on their name card. When they show their name cards to their clients, obviously, they think this can gain more trust and business for them. So I guess, while we think, the office is a place to house the workers, to communicate and to receive those letters, like the traditional letters, but often we overlook the intangible benefit of a physical office. It's also a proof of existence of business, a way to communicate with the public. So I guess if we're talking about the end of office, we kind of have to think whether those intangible benefits can be achieved by remote working.
Right, and so. Correct me if I'm wrong about this, Nikki, but I think you were already working from home a lot because of the Hong Kong protests, and then coronavirus. So you've been doing this for quite some time. From a personal point of view, and maybe for that of your peers in Hong Kong, how's it been these last couple of weeks when things have started to open up? Are you happy to come back to an office, even if it's the co-working space, before you move to the permanent place?
Absolutely. I'm really, really glad to be able to go back to office and meet my colleagues and talk to them. I have been working from home for almost 4 months. So in Hong Kong, we're a bit ahead of the curve compared to the rest of the world. And I was really reaching my limit on perhaps the 3rd month. But now, right now, like most people like me have returned to office, and we are seeing the traffic congestions in the morning peak hours, and all the shopping malls are filled with people on the weekends. And I even attended my very first physical press conference in a hotel this week, first time in 4 months. It has been like very nice to be able to see people again. But to be honest, I think the working from home idea is an interesting idea. Like from my own experience, actually I enjoyed it quite a lot at the very beginning, because I was quite impressed how much I can do when I don't have to put on makeup in the morning and take a bus to office, and when I cut the time chatting with my colleagues about almost everything. So actually, I worked more efficiently in the first months, but later it became harder for me to focus, as I got a very big distraction at home. I have a cat, so she would constantly seek attention when I was working at home. So I guess at the very end, I really missed my colleagues, even my boss. So I guess like face-to-face interaction is very important as a journalist, and a lot of our story idea came from spontaneous talks that cannot be planned or achieved by a Zoom talk. Yeah, so I was very happy to be able to be back in office. But I guess like as an employee like me, we enjoy the flexibility of being able to work from home, but we don't want it to be compulsory. And it would be very nice if the company can provide a third option like a co-working space, so it's easier for us to get to work without all the distractions at home.
Right. Well, I think for a lot of people who have been at home for a couple of months and are reaching that stage that it sounds like you got to fairly recently, or maybe after the first or second month, your story probably gives them a sense that there's some light at the end of the tunnel. I guess the last thing I would want to know about is just this idea again that about Hong Kong companies relocating to less central places. I mean, that seems, do you think that's a permanent shift, or is this something that they're just doing for now while the virus is affecting business?
Yeah, actually, it has been a trend for almost a decade, because the rent in Central is very expensive, and they simply don't want to pay that kind of rent right now, especially during the economic downturn. And for example, Hong Kong, we are in an economic recession, and I think like this is a business shift for a longer term, but just this coronavirus have accelerated such shift. But at the same time, it also provides some opportunities, for landlords who are able to, shift along with the need of, customers and companies.
Okay, terrific. Well, thanks so much, and we'll have to check in with you again once you've moved to the new office. So I think now we'll switch to a very heavy topic, and that's something that's got a lot of people worried. This is the debt overhang that we're accumulating around the world from the coronavirus fight back. As NAR reported yesterday, governments across Asia have unleashed these massive stimulus packages to weather the economic impact of the coronavirus. And the credit ratings or agencies are already starting to lower their outlooks for Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. Now, this is a problem worldwide, and it's a big debate issue in Europe and the United States, too. But Kenji, you've been close. You've been a close watcher of the debt situation in China for a long time. Now, after the Lehman crisis, China unleashed enormous amounts of stimulus. So far, it feels like they've been more restrained. What's going on there, and do you expect that to change?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for everyone who's on this, just investing their time on this webinar, and thank you, Chris, for the introduction. And I'm out in Hong Kong now from Monday, in self-quarantine right now. And actually, I have a story that I crossed the border was really different from what it was in the past. It should be uploaded in NAR website soon, so please read it after the webinar, please. And sorry, back to your question. Yes,
I'd recommend reading that story too. I just read it, and it's really interesting.
Thank you. Yes, about your question, one thing we really want to watch closely is the NPC, actually the two sessions that will start from tomorrow, which is CPPCC, another one, and then the main one, the NPC, National People's Congress, on Friday. And that is when Premier Li Keqiang will make a long speech. and there will be definitely a talk on how much fiscal spending will be done this year. And by the way, talking about the NPC, this was supposed to happen in March 5th, but
Right.
it's been postponed over 2 months. And it's finally beginning with a much smaller and actually shorter agenda. And talking about the point, the mainstream reading by economists and experts, pretty much that I've seen, is that China is definitely going to allow more fiscal spending, like in terms of with GDP, proportion to GDP, which was 2.8% last year. Like Nomura, Mr. Ting Lu, saying that the mainstream guess will be 3.5% or maybe to 4%. However, this is not this is no comparison to the 2008 autumn, where 4 trillion yuan was splashed out by the Chinese government to fight against the global financial crisis. And I think the reason is, I think most people agreed to this, is that China has learned the lesson in a very hard way. Of course, they claim themselves to be the savior of the world by spending so much money and propping up their economy and everyone else's economy. Maybe
And
that's
after Lehman, right?
right. But there were many overhangs, many things were left over, like the zombie companies or all sorts of facilities and assets that are not really economically viable, and banks with more bad debt. So I don't think there will be a huge, a massive spending like what happened in 2008.
Right. And as you pointed out, they declared war on debt a few years ago under Xi Jinping, right? And has that? It seems like some of the things that you and I and many other reporters had expected, maybe that there would be a shadow banking crisis or something like that. They've managed to hold those things at bay for now, but you have also been looking at the rise in a different kind of debt, right?
Yeah, right.
This has to do with how local governments fund themselves.
Yes, exactly. Yes. There was a nice report by S&P last week about the LGFV. This is an acronym for Local Government Funding Vehicles. And actually, this has been on the spotlight a few years ago, as you said, Chris, when there was a declaration of a fight or a war against a debt. And this is like a second purse for local governments in order to fund their infrastructure projects. Well, if those infrastructure projects are a good one, that's fine. Go ahead. But the problem is some of it are not. And these LGFVs are actually taking in more money from the market now. Let me tell you some of the numbers. According to Wind, which is a vendor who gather all these data, said that only during the 4 month between January and April, these all the LGFVs have raked in 966 billion yuan, and this is about 136 billion US dollars. And by just to show the comparison, last year was 1.1 trillion yuan for the whole year, and this was a lot more compared to 2018. So which means it's already 88% of what they got last year. It's a lot. And this is happening because not only because of the coronavirus, they need to prop up the economy and they need to make more investment on infrastructure, but the monetary situation was already easing because Chinese economy was already slowing down. And at the same time, investors to the LGFVs, by the way, they issue bonds. People who buy all these bonds are happen to be state-owned banks. and they tend to invest in LGFVs rather than investing their money in companies.
Right.
So therefore, they're able to LGFVs are able to get more money out of it. And if these investment goes right, that's fine. But just like what happened in 2008, a lot of the investment, all these investment created zombie companies and zombie assets, and left bad loans on the banks.
Right.
And so that's the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, for these, and people are actually looking at it now very closely.
So we mentioned Buffett and the U.S. airlines recently. You have been looking at the Chinese airlines.
Right.
What's the story there?
Yeah. It's the airline crisis is it's not only for the United States, it's for everyone, and including Chinese airlines. And in China, there's three large airlines, and they're all state-owned. And their revenue was for the first quarter, in aggregate, they lost 46% of the revenue compared to a year ago, and they were all in red, and they lost so much money. But the thing is, they're in a very special position that they are able to rake in a lot of cash. According to what I found from their disclosure of their quarterly earnings, they actually raked in about $5 billion US over the 3 months period. And of course, they're in a crisis, but they're big state-owned enterprises, they're fine. But the problem is, once all these companies started getting to take advantage of easy money situation, and some companies will get into trouble, and that will leave the problems in the future. And another thing I want to mention about corporate financing in China is the problem of privately owned enterprises.
Right.
They always have problem finding cash, finding money, finding capital for their business. If you're Alibaba, Tencent, you're fine. But not all of them are like Alibaba, Tencent. And even though the monetary situation is easing, it's very hard still for private enterprises to get whatever cash they need. And so for them, the coronavirus itself is a problem. Not the debt, but maybe the existing that they have. But the coronavirus itself is not really, the easing monetary condition is not really helping many of the POEs, privately owned enterprises in China. And there are actually S&P, this is from Moody's. Moody's analysts are saying that according to what they found, even though the total amount of bond issuance has been growing, only about 10% went to privately owned enterprises. This is in the month of March. So there's an uneven spread of money at the same time. That's another different set of issues, actually.
So just for the last question here, we were talking. You've said that you think that Beijing's showed that they're pretty good at not letting these debt things blow up because they have various policy tools. But there's a twist here now, right? That has to do with growth.
Right. Yeah. Actually, I must admit that I have been writing stories about how the Chinese debt situation actually is a crisis, and we have to be careful. But actually, China has been using a different set of policy tools, and they've handled it pretty well, I must admit. But I think the two major aspects that actually help them overcome all these problems. One is growth, as you said. Right. And if the economy is growing at like 10% or 15 or whatever percentage, that's fine. I mean, the growth will cover up all these problems. but you cannot expect that anymore. And Chinese government knows that really well. So that's one of the reasons why they're not going to be doing another 4 trillion yuan type splashing out cash again. And another thing is demographic. China is also entering into a phase where birth rate is low, even though they've shifted their one-child policy. It's kind of too late. And they don't really have the backup, like the pension system, ready for people to go ahead and spend. And here comes the coronavirus. Maybe a different new industry may prop up from this, but a lot of the traditional industry will be gone. And how world see China has been changing as well.
Right.
And so, yes, it will be a very difficult moment actually difficult time for China. And this is another thing we may want to watch. This is a very few chance at the NPC that the Chinese high-ranking, top-ranking government officials will be and party officials will be speaking. And I'll keep on watching from the TV from a quarantine room in Hong Kong.
Well, and all of that with the in the backdrop, this kind of increasing the trade tensions that we've had. Just
I would have mentioned that.
Things. It seems like the coronavirus has brought out an even nastier edge to some of this between the US and China.
Yes, exactly. Yes, you're right. Yes.
Yeah. Well, so I think we can now shift to a slightly we'll move down to Southeast Asia and speak to Shotaro. You've been watching the startup scene in Indonesia and also in Southeast Asia for a while. This has been really exciting because you've watched the birth of all of these unicorns in Indonesia. You've seen, but now the mood has shifted a little bit, right? Can you just tell us what's been going on recently that you've been seeing?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you to everyone who's joined in. I saw on the YouTube comment that there were people from Germany, Albania, and those kind of places. So thank you very much for investing your time into our webinar. So the startups. So if you remember, last year we kind of saw a shift in the startup scene in that there was a whole WeWork fiasco. So WeWork was valued at some extravagant amount of money. But it turned out they weren't making enough money to justify that valuation. So after that, not just in the US, but in Asia as well, investors were more looking at the profitability or the path to profitability of the startups. And they were telling startups, you shouldn't burn that much cash, be more cash prudent and not pursue growth just for growth's sake. So that was going to be the trend this year until the coronavirus struck. And coronavirus hadn't really changed that trend, but I think it's kind of definitely taken that to the extreme. So I think startups are having to save cash even more because they have to survive the next 3 or 4 months. So the situation is obviously getting tough for them. There are a number of reports saying how term sheets, which is a non-binding investment document that lays out venture capital's investment terms and conditions, they've been pulled for startups, which means they probably won't be getting any new funding anytime soon. So one of the things that the startups have been doing in this region have been they're having to reduce their overhead. And one way, obviously, to do that is to get rid of their staff or to furlough their staff. So I think you can see on your screen right now. So even the most prominent ones like Traveloka, which was Indonesia's answer to Expedia, and it was one of the unicorns, one of the companies valued at over $1 billion, private companies valued over $1 billion. They had to let go of 100 people. I think this was in April. This was 10% of their overall staff. And Grab, which is, the darling of Southeast Asia's startup scene, they had to ask their staff across the countries that they operate in to take voluntary no pay leave. So it's having a massive impact the coronavirus is having a massive impact on the startup scene, and we're not sure how this will pan out. Really.
But we've seen in other boom and bust cycles in technology, whether you had a lot of players, and then I'm thinking of the late '90s. You had a lot of players. A lot of them went out of business, and then out of that came some companies that are still really strong today. Do you think that we're going to see some? It's going to become clearer in Southeast Asia and Indonesia in particular, who really is the strong and enduring player in some of these sectors, whether it's e-commerce or payments or other things.
Yeah, so naturally, the sectors that reduce human-to-human contact are still doing well in this coronavirus time. So e-commerce is obviously one of the sectors. So Bukalapak, which is another Indonesian unicorn, they're one of the biggest e-commerce platforms in Indonesia. They said their April numbers, transaction volume for April was near their all-time high.
Wow.
And logistics, I mean, people are having to order things online now, and e-commerce is their gateway to that. But who actually delivers them? Logistics companies. So logistic companies in Indonesia, Singapore, they've been attracting some funds in these times. And this trend,
that's the less sexy stuff, but it's also essential, right?
Yeah. And obviously this trend, I mean, people that haven't really shopped online, say like people over the 40s or in their 50s, who preferred to go to physical stores to shop, now they're having to adopt online shopping. So I think these kind of trends will stay in e-commerce, logistics, those kind of things will continue doing well. And for other sectors or other startups rather, if they actually survive this coronavirus period, it shows to the investors down the road when all this is over that they are bulletproof, that they're pandemic crisis proof, right? So, which is a huge boost for investors. They know that a startup A has been able to survive this crisis. They're confident that even if another crisis hits, they'll probably be able to survive. So that'll be something to watch out for. And there's actually been some outliers as well. So food and beverage business has been hardest hit by the coronavirus. But there's this startup in Indonesia called Kopi Kenangan, which is a coffee chain, a grab and go coffee chain. They raised $109 million in May, which is a very large amount.
This month, they raised that much this month.
Yeah, so admittedly, they were in talks before all of this blew up. But the investors actually committing to investing $109 million this month shows that they're confident in this company. And the reason is that they were actually profitable last year. So they were keeping their costs under control. They don't have like a massive physical store, so their overhead is low. And these kind of sound economics gives confidence to investors regardless of the situation. And just to throw some data in there, so Deal Street Asia, which is one of our Nikkei subsidiaries, their data shows that Southeast Asia's venture capitals raised $3.6 billion from investors in 2019, which was a 68% increase compared to 2018. So there's still a lot of cash sloshing around in this region. So if the startups can show to the investors that, look, we're cash prudent and we can withstand this crisis, there's a high chance that more investors actually will come back into this region after all this is over.
Right. So let's now switch to another big trend in your region, and that has to do with the supply chain. Mm-hmm. So because of the trade war and other factors, some companies have been wanting to shift out of mainland China and towards Southeast Asia. And this is everything from garment companies all the way to high-tech companies. So there's a view out there that the coronavirus has created an even bigger rethink of the supply chain because people don't want to be too exposed to one place. So what's the view on Southeast Asia as a place that's going to attract some of these factories that may be looking to move out of China?
So yeah, I think Southeast Asia is definitely one of the regions that manufacturers especially will be looking to moving their productions. And there was a nice report from Citigroup the other day which said economies that would likely benefit are countries like Vietnam, India, Malaysia, Taiwan, which has high degrees of export similarity compared to China and therefore have supply chains already in place. On the other hand, countries like Indonesia, where I'm placed, won't benefit greatly from this overall trend because it's basically a manufacturing laggard. Manufacturing isn't that strong in this country. And when people talk about relocating their production, they, especially because they're thinking about it from all this pandemic and crisis, they're probably looking at they're likely to place a greater emphasis on the government's ability to manage risks and their disaster mitigation capabilities, which again doesn't bode well for the likes of Indonesia, which is still seeing, like, I think we saw the highest number of rising coronavirus cases today, which are over 600 and close to 700, I think. So it shows that the government hasn't really been able to get a grip of this situation, and I think manufacturers, companies, investors, they'll be looking at how the government handles this crisis when they're thinking about relocating.
So just thinking about government competence that way, it seems that Vietnam has been one of the standouts, both in terms of attracting tech companies and other kinds of companies who want to make things there, and they also seem to have done a pretty good job with the coronavirus.
Yeah. We've had a couple of reports about how Apple's trying to move production to Vietnam with regards to their AirPods. I saw a report just today, I think, or yesterday, saying Apple, their new overhead headphones, they're going to manufacture that in Vietnam as well. So Vietnam really seems to be seems to be the main beneficiary out of all this.
I think our colleagues in Taipei had a story that said that Google, during the coronavirus crisis, pretty early on, they had they were building a facility in China, and they asked if they could physically take the factory apart and ship it to Vietnam to be reassembled so they could start building products there. So that's a fascinating idea. Can you think of some other companies that have been looking, specific companies, tech companies that have been looking to move to Southeast Asia?
Well, out of our reporting, I think you mentioned Google, Microsoft, I think reported on as well. Apple, I mentioned, Hewlett Packard and Dell, I think are relocating outside of China. And Japan, they're saying they're going to subsidize companies that move production out of China back to Japan or other countries. And as far as I know, Japan is the only country to come out with such policy. Right. But we may see, manufacturing is a massive, they employ a lot of people, and a lot of these ASEAN countries, they need somewhere for their young population to work for. So we might see similar policies coming out of the ASEAN countries as well.
Right. I guess we should say it's probably not all positive. We've seen, I think in Thailand, some of the car makers are cutting back, but but anyway, it'll be interesting to see how this works out. I think there are high expectations for Southeast Asia after this virus recedes. So I think that's it for this the formal part of the discussion, but we do have some questions from the audience, which is pretty exciting. Now you'll have to bear with, this is our maiden voyage in webinar land. But I think we can handle this. So we had a lot of questions from people who were interested in this office idea and in the commercial property area. So we just chose one. One person wrote in and said, "I'm in the office leasing business. Will the present crisis affect my business? And if it does, what should I do about it?" Nikki, do you want to field that one? Remember, you've got your mute on. Yeah, there you go.
Hi, sorry. Sure, yeah. Actually, the coronavirus pandemic is affecting office leasing business as a whole. But I guess there are also some opportunities right now because, the demand from companies are becoming different. Like, for example, companies are telling me they want to have more flexible terms on their lease, and they're looking for smaller spaces because they might have to lay off some workers. So for those landlords who can, change fast to adapt to this kind of new needs, will gain some new business, I guess. Especially right now, office hygiene has become a greater concern for most companies. We're still in the middle of health crisis, and landlord who can, demonstrate that they have the ability to keep the workers safe while they return to office will be, benefit right now.
That's fascinating. I hadn't really thought about the office hygiene demand now. So I guess that's good for more good news for hand sanitizer makers, probably.
Sure.
People who make cleaning products and so forth. So we can move on to the second question, which picks up on our last theme. So they're asking about the business sector that's best placed for the new normal in Southeast Asia after the virus is over with. So that's a big subject, but Tani-san, do you want to give it a shot? I think, yeah.
So as I mentioned, e-commerce, logistics, the sectors that cater to this new normal of less human-to-human contact, I think will continue to benefit post-corona. One thing I forgot to mention was e-education. So we've seen a couple of Indonesian startups actually do quite well in this when schools are all closed. So that's one sector that I would point out. Maybe like telcos, people are having to communicate online more. So telcos, I don't know if they would benefit. Maybe if more people use online meetings, and if maybe that would benefit. But it might increase their costs as well. But on the flip side, sectors like construction, especially in countries like Indonesia, where government has been spending quite a lot of money into building new toll roads and new buildings, they would probably take quite a lot of hit because the government's having to divert funds into the economic stimulus to tackle this coronavirus. Right.
Although I guess there's still a new capital to build, but that's
yeah, actually, so the government has had to reallocate some of the funds that they had for the new capital to building hospitals and building up health infrastructure. Wow. So we don't know how much of a delay it's going to cause the reallocation of funds, how much of a delay that's going to cause for the new capital. But it's a possibility.
Oh wow, that's fascinating. And here's another really big picture one for you, Kawase-san. So the question is, will the COVID-19 situation increase regional political and economic tensions among Asian countries? What do you think?
Yeah, I wish that there will be decreased tensions in the region, but I guess it will not be that way. There will be an increase in tensions. I think that the backdrop would be the U.S.-China tension that has only exacerbated by the coronavirus, as we have just witnessed in WHA, the annual assembly of WHO meeting over who's responsible for this whole thing, and also how the WHO has acted to it. Donald Trump and Xi Jinping are on a completely two different sides. And not only that, but pretty much about everything. Many countries in the region will have to make their calls. Which side will they have to take? Of course, not for every single issues, but for many cases, they will have to decide whether they would go for the United States or go with Beijing. And that will not only be a good thing to alleviate tension, it would just only add to tension. And another thing is, just like Warren Buffett mentioned, it's a different world for travel industry, and people are not going to travel, and people are not going to see each other. Then one of the things that actually kept things moving in terms of less tension was that people see each other. Of course, we can see each other like this, but it's really nice. Like Nikki said, people like to gather in the office and see each other, even though you want to see your boss after. So, but that will be not gone completely, but be much less. Like just April figure in Japan's visitor arrival just announced today, 99.9% decline. So less people are coming to Japan, less people are going to China, less people are going to the United States. So less human contacts is not a good sign, I guess, to alleviate tension. I want to remain hopeful, but I don't think I could be so optimistic at this point.
Right. And as you say, no country in the region wants to be forced to choose, right?
Definitely. I mean, that's like the worst case scenario for everyone in the region, I guess.
Yeah. But that pressure seems to be building in some cases.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
Well, I think that's we're coming to the end. I just wanted to say thanks to everyone for being with us on our on Nikkei Asian Review's maiden webinar. I hope you've enjoyed it. I think it's been fun for us and a new experience for us. And thanks for reading our website. Thanks for reading our newsletters. Thanks for reading our print magazine. And remember, if you like what you saw and you like what you heard, please think about subscribing, because we are a subscription business. And that really helps us out and helps us do the work of reporting in lots of different countries and sending journalists out to do interesting and ambitious work. So thank you very much. And that's it from Tokyo. How about you guys? Farewell from Hong Kong, Jakarta.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much from Hong Kong.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a million. Bye.